Welcome everyone to my talk in VRDC. I'm Chad Dawson. I'm a project lead at Double Fine Productions. The title of my talk is Reinventing Psychonauts for Virtual Reality. I'm currently working on a Psychonauts game at Double Fine, Psychonauts in the Rhombus of Ruin. It's for Sony's PlayStation VR. It's an upcoming title coming out in the next few months. First, I'll give an overview of what we're talking about today. Why Psychonauts in VR? We'll start with some inspiration on kind of how we got the idea to take Psychonauts to VR and why we picked that title to work on. Then we'll start talking about adaptation, changes we made to gameplay, locomotion, controls, iteration, how we iterated on the controls and targeting, went through a number of different prototypes, eventually settled on the control configuration that we came up with. And then finally, innovation, how we overcame design challenges. With any project, you'll run into hurdles, you run into things that don't work right and things that do. We'll give a few examples of what worked for us and might work for you as well. It all started just over a year ago, summer 2015. We were all excited, as most of you are, about the new VR tech coming out. I'd done some research back in grad school in the 90s with the old Lawnmower Man style giant helmets, some prototypes back then. A number of our team had backed the Oculus Rift. We're playing around with the DK2s. As a studio, Double Fine has always kind of taken on new technology. We made games for the Microsoft Kinect, Happy Action Theater, Kinect Party, and we also did some for the Leap controller, one called Autonomous. We had a lot of ideas, but we weren't really sure which one would be best. We were kind of all over the place, but Double Fine had something else in the works, something our fans had been asking for a long time. Psychonauts 2. We'd planned on crowdfunding Psychonauts 2 later that same year, and we hit on an idea. As Tim was starting to write the story for these, there was a missing part, and we thought, what if we made a Psychonauts VR game? It could tell the story between Psychonauts 1 and Psychonauts 2, and it would be in VR. It'd come out earlier than Psychonauts 2 and accelerate our art and engine pipeline. We wanted to get together some assets and stuff for starting the crowdfunding for it, but we didn't have much look development done yet. But how would Psychonauts work in VR? Released in 2005, Psychonauts was an action platformer. How many of you are familiar with the original game? Show of hands. Okay, most of you, good. It's an action platformer using third-person follow cam. As you can see here, your main character, Raz, he's an acrobat. It features double jumps, high-speed rail slides, wild gravity flips, dynamic motion combat. We quickly learned that following this type of motion with a camera in VR can be very disorienting and make players physically uncomfortable and sick if you try to just latch a camera to it. We started experimenting with fixed and rail cams that try to reduce the camera motion a little bit when we were trying stuff out, but it pulled us too far away from our characters and was still making us a bit nauseous. But Psychonauts had more going on than just dynamic third-person action. Looking past the camera mechanics of the game, it also received critical acclaim for its unique visual style, stylized look, story, characters, and the humor. A significant part of the game was told through cinematic cutscenes and vignettes like this one, featuring camera pans, close-ups, and handcrafted animation. When you ask many people about the game, I think this is kind of what they remember getting to know the characters as much as they do the third-person action. But cinematic camera movements like this are a bit jarring in VR. It's hard to pan the camera in and do a close-up without the player feeling uncomfortable. And other techniques like letterboxing to tell the player that you're in cinematic mode, none of your controls will work, didn't make much sense. Our artists were starting on the visual development. We were bringing our characters up to a more modern rendering technique, and we're using the Unreal 4 engine. You can see that the characters look a lot different than they did 10 years ago. They did an amazing job getting the characters and lighting, and we really wanted to show off that expressiveness. We didn't want to put you in a camera just behind the character where you couldn't see the expressions on their face, or have them be far away where you couldn't tell what they were doing. So for inspiration, we looked at story and development in the original title. In Psychonauts, Raz, as shown here in this video, had the ability to travel into other characters' minds. But you never really got to see what it was like in Raz's mind. You never really got to see things from his perspective. We started to explore first-person camera to see what would it look like to be looking out the eyes and the famous goggles of Raz himself. This is some footage of our new game, Rhombus of Ruin. In this case, we show the first-person mode. This perspective feels more immersive. It finally feels like you're actually in the world of Psychonauts and not just seeing it from above, running behind a character. This sense of scale felt more personal. the familiar characters from the game took on new life. There's more of a connection of a character like Lily here, as she fails to meet your gaze, looks down, or draws your attention by looking over your shoulder. The adult character here has to lean down to talk to you, and that's something you really didn't see in the first game, that sense of scale, that you're a kid, you're a 12-year-old boy, and you're with adults. They lean down to talk to you. That sense of them being condescending to you or nice to you, you get a better feel for it as soon as you get in first person. This perspective worked well as we started to look at the psychic abilities. In the first game, Raz was at a psychic summer camp, and he learned how to do all psychic powers. One of our favorite was pyrokinesis. Lighting stuff on fire with your mind is always kind of fun. Psyblast is also fun. There's nothing like shooting a bolt of lightning out of your head. This was particularly neat in VR, as it kind of felt like it was coming from your mind. Use it to blow stuff up and open doors. You can even use it to hit different things in the level. It's particularly fun. But we wanted something, missed a slide there. Here we go, something a little bit more subtle. We added a psychic poke. It's sort of our bread and butter interaction players to touch the world a little less destructively. You don't always want to blow stuff up. This goes to a little bit to a point and click adventure style, where you're just interacting with something or just annoying your friends. My favorite adaptation was telekinesis, moving an object around with your mind. It worked surprisingly well in our game, as you could pick objects up, move them around by moving your head. It worked well with our characters too. We added eye and head tracking. Characters would follow what you're doing. They'd swat it away if it got too close. This added a sense of immersion to our characters that we didn't really have with them just sitting there doing idle animation loops. It made the characters feel more responsive, more alive. Many players were surprised. Once they figured out that they could do this and the characters would react to it, they would spend the whole rest of the demo just trying to stack pillows and hit the other characters in the face. The more you can add to your game to do character interaction, to have them respond to things and look at it, the more players will connect with your characters. We now had a pretty compelling experience from Raz's perspective, just sitting there and looking around. But how would the player move through the world? We know we wanted our levels to be bigger than just one room where you're sitting in one spot. Our next challenge was locomotion. Two of our guiding design principles in making this game were accessibility and comfort. The original game was accessible to a lot of people, a wide range of audience, and a wide range of player styles. Some people went to the game just for the story, others went for it for the fun mechanics. We wanted to include all of them. We recognize that for many players, this could be their first VR experience. We didn't want them taking off the headset after the first few minutes and not coming back. The game itself is a little bit longer than a few demos that are only a few minutes. We're looking at around a 2 to 3 hour experience that we're hoping some players might play start to finish from the beginning to end, but we divided it up into smaller chunks. We wanted to preserve a comfortable seated experience. We wanted to avoid VR nausea of running around, jumping players through the world that some people get with more action-paced games. Again, we turned to the original Psychonauts for inspiration. In the original game, the player could walk up to another character and use the psychic power of clairvoyance to briefly see things through another character's point of view. In this demo, you see him going up to characters and they see Raz a little bit differently. Sometimes their perspective on the world can be a little bit different. One of them sees him as a hockey player, another sees him as I think that's a hockey player one there. It all depends on their personality. It really lets you sort of develop the characters out. So we thought, rather than clairvoyance just giving the player a temporary viewpoint, what if we use that as our locomotion? What if we use that to be a persistent point of view? The player could target another character across the room and then jump into their mind. Now they'd see things from that character's perspective. The player could stay in that point of view as long as they wanted, looking around, using their abilities. They could even clairvoyance into yet another character, look around, and use their abilities from there. With this method of teleportation, we could move the player around from character to character in different points of the room. You can chain clairvoyance from one character to another, going back to characters you'd been before, and move between a number of points in the world. Your main character, Raz, the character you're in, stays in one place using his psychic ability. This was also working with our storyline, as we wanted the characters to be captured. We wanted them to figure out a way to escape. We were shifting more from the platforming stuff in the original game to more of a puzzle-based experience, using your psychic abilities to solve puzzles. Let's see here. Can you guys hear it? Should have a little audio. See if I can turn it up. Are you getting any audio on the audio out? Yeah, let me try that again. Well, this video we're showing here, not audio, but I can talk you through it a little bit. It shows an example of using all your gameplay abilities. Here the player must use clairvoyance to go into a rat in an overhead compartment. They must use poke to open up cabinets. They see a character over the right sticking his hand out of the bathroom door. They use telekinesis to grab some toilet paper and hand it to him. He shouts back at them that it's not enough. He needs something a little bit more. What else can you do? So in this case, the player realizes they can use their telekinesis ability and their pyro ability together to give the coach in the background a little surprise. It's a different type of gameplay, but it's something we were shifting to more with puzzles. But an important consideration was also our controller scheme. We wanted to keep it simple and accessible. All the different controllers coming out, we didn't want to limit our audience to ones that just had hand controllers. We wanted it to be able to work with the gamepad as well. Initially, we considered looking at a pop-up menu to select abilities like the original game did. In the original game, you could select from your different abilities and map that to one of your buttons and have a couple of them going, but we really wanted to focus on you combining your abilities. And we wanted to limit the amount of UI. Having a UI pop up all the time you wanted to use an ability in our game, which you use pretty often, would be a little bit annoying to see it come up in your face. And tricky, as your world environment could obscure the UI. We ended up doing a controller mapping that mapped the abilities to the different buttons. And that way the player could use multiple abilities at the same time. This had a number of challenges using a gamepad controller. The first was unfamiliarity. When you're in a VR headset, most players can't look down and see what their controller is doing. If they don't know the controller very well, they're not going to know what different buttons are, no matter how much you tell them. So to solve that, we showed the full controller diagram. Rather than just showing a symbol of a button to press, which someone might not remember, a triangle or an L2 button or an X, show a picture of the whole controller with the button highlighted. This technique worked particularly well, as players can fumble around with the controller and try to get their thumb or finger in the right position. As long as you're forgiving with the controls, they'll find the button. But too much familiarity can also cause an issue. People coming from using gamepad controllers with other games typically like to use the sticks. Initially, we let the right stick move the camera. We quickly found that that was not a good thing to do. Having people move the camera with their head and then also right stick can really make you sick fast. But you shouldn't discount players using the controllers completely. By watching people's hands when they're playtesting, we're able to figure out which buttons they felt were intuitive. Some of the combinations, like holding down telekinesis and pyro, some players had an intuition on kind of which trigger finger might be used for telekinesis, and which ones would be easier to combine with others. We also explored a motion track gamepad controller. On the PlayStation, some of you might know, the DualShock controller has a sensor in the front and sensors inside, which let the camera which tracks your head also track the position of the controller. For telekinesis, we combined letting you move it around with your head, moving it around with the controller, and moving it around with the sticks. We tried all combinations of those to see what people found would work well. We actually found that moving around your head worked well with our game because it gave you more of a feeling that you were psychic. Once you started moving it around with your hands using a controller, it started to feel like it was something in your hand that you were reaching out. But to give you that sense of presence that you were psychically moving it, moving your head worked. We also had a wide variation of what players would do when they would hold the controller. Many players would just like to hold it in their lap. Not many would intuitively lift it up and try to move it from a seated experience. In addition to using it for telekinesis, we had it work with rotation where players could flip objects around. But flipping the controller over 180 puts it in a weird configuration for people to hold and try to hit the other buttons. Eventually, with our design, we backed away from rotating objects. We left it as an option on the right stick, but it's more for players to just inspect something, and we didn't use it for any critical gameplay. Our targeting, we use the headset. Rather than using a hand controller to point at things, we look at stuff with your head. And as I was saying, we found this had an unexpected but pretty desirable effect of the player feeling more like a psychic. We found that if you were using your mind to control something, if you were trying to look at it with your head and move it, rather than a tracked controller or a wand in your hand, it felt less like a magic wand, less like a laser pointer, less like a tool in your hand. You felt more like a psychonaut in the game than a wizard or an artist or a mechanic. But it ran into its set of issues as well. With head track targeting, players are less precise. It's rare for someone to hold their head and look at something with a fixed gaze and hold it in the exact spot for very long. To combat that, we did generous and sticky target selection. When you look at something in our game, it would highlight. And we had a number of different objects, and players would try to look at them. But as we started building up the worlds, the density got pretty big. We tried to reduce that and reduce the number of things you could target, but still players had trouble figuring out what they were targeting and if they were targeting it correctly. Sometimes they would see something and try to turn their head to look at it, but would have a hard time getting it under a cursor or getting it under their view. To do that, we opened up our selection and made it more generous and sticky. Generous meaning you didn't have to look exactly at something, you just had to look near it, and it would find the closest one. And sticky meaning when you looked away, it would still keep your selection on it for a while. We also didn't require accuracy. Initially, our puzzles had the player being very accurate with stuff. You had to pick up a bomb, move it through a hallway without it touching the walls or it would explode, or insert a key into a lock and turn it. All of these were tricky to do, and we had some players on the team who were pretty good at it, but for most players it was hard to do, particularly if you started to get neck fatigue. Moving your head around a target, and particularly moving stuff around, is one of the primary inputs. People's necks can get tired. To combat that, we tried to limit the required movement range. We didn't want to have the players have to move something from the far left side of their vision to the far right, or up and down. We didn't want you to have to do repeated movements over and over. We also removed time pressure. As I said initially, we had a ticking time bomb that you had to get down the hallway without hitting the wall. People would try to do that really fast, and one of the tricks you could do to it was to kind of sling your neck really fast to throw the object down the hall. And players would do that. Some would do it quite violently and almost shake the headset off because they were running out of time. So in our game design, we started removing anything that gave the player time pressure and tweaking the puzzles to be more solution finding on what to move and where to put it, as opposed to how to do it in a quick amount of time. Dialogue was also a challenge for us. Double Fine games have always had charming dialogue and quite a lot of it. But sometimes you need to give feedback on what the player is doing, particularly if they're doing something wrong. Initially, we had some generic dialogue responses, things like oop or bummer or nope, if you tried to do something and the player wasn't succeeding. But as we started playtesting it, players got confused. We were watching them play and hearing the sounds and knowing what they were doing wrong, but the players weren't getting the feedback. We started changing the statements to be a little bit more specific. Rather than just a generic thing, be more particular and state the verb and object in what you're saying. Say, I can't burn that book, or that crate is too heavy to lift. Often when players are looking around, they'll hit a button, hit the wrong button, think they're doing pyrokinesis on something to burn it, but they're actually trying to pick it up. They're looking at an object just to the right of the object they were trying to pick up. So getting a specific response back really helps keep them on the right track and make sure they don't get confused or misdirected. It's something that, with a point-and-click adventure game and a lot of other game styles, people tend to leave their cursor on the object they're interacting with. They take their focus on it. But if you're using head-based tracking, players will look at something and then look away. So reminding them what they were doing and what they were looking at can often be helpful. We love the clairvoyance mechanic of traveling through our levels from one character's mind to another, but it also gave us a few problems. When you teleport to a character, we would use the way that character is facing to give you a hint at where you're going to be looking once you go into them. In this picture on the left, you can see the character Mia kind of staring at the monitor. And if you go into her perspective, that's what you're going to see. That worked out great. We put characters close to things. She could watch a whole cartoon show on that monitor, switch the channels, solve a puzzle with it. But then what would you do? Because she was close to it and facing a wall, she didn't have any other characters in her field of view. In order to move to another character using our locomotion system, a player would have to look over their shoulder or turn around 180 in their chair or get up. And that's something we wanted to try to avoid. This is the top view of the level we were looking at in the jet. The roof's cut away and you can kind of see the shape of it. Raz, your main character, is shown in the center, and I've highlighted his field of targeting in yellow. And I use the phrase field of targeting instead of field of view. Field of view can often be pretty wide. In fact, you can look all around you 360. But your field of targeting is more limited. Field of targeting is kind of what you're going to turn your head to look at as you use head-based targeting. We found that a range of around 90 to 120 degree arc would work. Sometimes we had to open it up a little bit more, but that's what most players felt comfortable with. Vertical up-down head movement, a pitch arc of looking up and down to find another character is definitely less, but most of our levels featured more of a horizontal layout design than a vertical one. In this level, we showed you going up into the squirrel and an overhead bin. That's about the level we'd go in vertical. Here you can see overlapping fields of other characters targeting each other. Those are also shown in yellow. If you look in the center, you can see the center 3 characters have overlapping field of view. All of them have another character within their arc, but none of them have a good view of the character in the upper right. He's a hard character to get to unless we rotate one of the character's seats, and that sort of became our tuning game in the levels of going through and saying, can you see somebody else from this position or not? You might also notice that we don't have very good coverage in the back of the plane seen on the left-hand side. We had to come up with a creative solution so the player could easily get back there and find the toilet paper to hand the coach hanging out in the bathroom. So, as shown on the left here, we added a squirrel and an overhead bin who had a good point of view of that area. Some level layouts work out better than others, and this is something we discovered probably about halfway, 3/4 way through the project. I wish we would have known earlier. Long rectangular levels don't work pretty good, or don't work too well for this motion. This type of locomotion. You have to kind of have characters facing the front and then also ones facing the back so you can move from one end to the other. It turns out, with no small coincidence, that our second level was a circle. And a lot of our other levels after that ended up being this way. This is an example of our outpost level. Might be a little hard to see because of the yellow light in the center, but we positioned a bunch of guards around the outside. In making a circular level, and I've seen a few other games do this where they do an arena kind of style, with a bunch of characters on the outside facing in, you always have a clear point of view of where you're going to go and where you're going to go to. It also helps with the player's sense of spatiality. Where am I in the level? Sometimes we found when you would go to a character and they were facing a way you hadn't seen, players would lose their sense of direction. They wouldn't quite know where they were or how to get back. Circular level design worked pretty good because you can position them on the outside and they can always see in, with multiple targets to choose from. So, to wrap things up a little bit and to conclude what we're talking about, just don't add VR to your title. It's just because your game can be played on a headset doesn't mean it's a right title for VR or that it's the right platform for it. Adapt your gameplay and controls to the strength of your medium and your title. In looking at the original Psychonauts game, we found a number of features that we felt would work well. The psychic abilities, we extended some features like the clairvoyance to not just give you a different view, but to let you get around the world and see characters from a different perspective. Try to find the things in your game, particularly if you're adapting one, that map well to VR, but then also look at what in VR works well for your game. It might be a first-person perspective works better for you. It might be you want to keep a third-person perspective. It's great to be seeing all the things that people are doing out there, and that kind of brings me to the next point, is that it's still a new and fertile ground. You'll hear people in some of their talks and some things say that they've solved locomotion, or they've solved targeting, or they've solved shooting, but the more I've seen on the different titles, the more I've seen people doing it different ways, and different ways that work right for their game, for what they're trying to do. So feel free to explore. Just because someone else is doing something a certain way, don't feel like you don't have to test it again yourself. You might find that what didn't work for them, what didn't work for us even, with the hand controllers and rotating objects, might be perfect for your game, depending on the context. But also realize you're going to have unexpected challenges. Like I showed at the end, the character facing, we thought our locomotion system was great, but then we realized you couldn't get around many of the levels. We had to reposition characters, add new characters. That can come, if that comes too late, it might be hard for you to correct that. Give yourself time to explore them. Give yourself a chance to get your new ideas in, iterate on them, and get them to a point where your game can really shine. That wraps things up. You guys have any questions?
I've got one.
Sure, go ahead.
How did you deal with
Oh, go ahead to the mic. Thank you. Yeah, if you could state your name and the question, I'll repeat it back for everybody.
Hi, Caitlin. How do you deal with when you have clairvoyance to teleport into another character's presence or mind? How do you deal with the fact that you're suddenly occupying another character's body? Like if you're moving your hand controllers, do you see the other like NPC's hand moving?
Okay, sure. Let me restate it. Caitlin was asking, when you go into another character, how do you deal with the player accepting that other character's body? That's one thing I didn't mention in the talk, but that we looked at, and many games look at, is when you're, in a character, do you draw the character's body or not? Because we weren't using hand controllers and we weren't mapping your arm movements, it felt kind of weird for your character to be sitting there not really mapping you. So when we go into a character, we don't draw their body at all. We turn off props and accessories they have, like a pencil or notebook, so you don't see your character. We found that most players found that more acceptable. We do certain things like change your eye distance to make you feel smaller or bigger in limited amount of scales if you go into a small character. And we do, in certain characters not shown, they see the world differently. They might see a sunny day instead of a rainy day, or characters a little bit differently to try to give their personality. But in general, we don't draw the body. It's a choice we made. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Joost. It seems like all the abilities you have in the game fit very nicely with the original Psychonauts game. Was there anything you guys wanted to do in the game that you couldn't make fit with the original game and you scrapped, or just couldn't explain away?
Right. We looked at, so to ask this question, he was, Rose was asking, were there any abilities in the original game that didn't work? A lot of the original game was combat focused, so blowing stuff up. And like I said, we shifted to a little bit more puzzle solving. We added that one ability just to give something a light poke, a little bit more of a point and click interaction. But there were abilities in the original game that I thought would be cool to put in that we didn't, such as invisibility. We tried to figure out a way to do it, but since we weren't drawing your character, you were kind of already invisible. We thought we might tweak it to make other stuff invisible, but that's something we might look at DLC or an add-on. There's always more to add. Hopefully that answers your question. Thanks. Go ahead.
You brought up something very interesting with level design specifically. I was wondering if you found that painting points of interest vertically, things that were above the player, if you had a challenge getting their attention that way.
So his question was, with level design, did we look at the challenges of moving vertically? We did a little bit. Some of our initial puzzles, you were in a prison that was very vertical based with a lot of prison cells and different levels that you would go up. We do a few things. We have a particular sort of boss battle in the game with a giant character that's bigger than you, that you look up and you have to fight. One thing we found is that we didn't really want to keep the player looking up a lot, particularly our game where you're moving stuff around. If your neck is craned at an angle and you're having to move stuff with your neck craned, people got fatigued a lot sooner. For simple navigation or drawing someone's attention, I think it works pretty well. It's nice to hear a sound up there or see something and look up. That really gives you a sense of scale and perspective, particularly on levels with open skies and bigger spaces. But we didn't really use it for navigation too much. Thank you. Anybody else? One coming from the back.
So did you ever, so I'm assuming you didn't ever try to like twist their head around basically, right? Like you let them move and look at things, but did you ever try experimenting with maybe gently moving their head?
We did a little bit.
Up or down, and how did that go?
One thing that we kind of wanted to focus on was that you were going into a player's point of view and you were in that view. I've seen some games, I think the recent Batman Arkham one has where you can press a button and your view suddenly switches 180. We tried a technique like that, but it felt like you were more of a ghost hovering over their head. It kind of lost that connection with you being in the character. As I said, if you see the way a character is facing, that gave you a clue at what you might see. You might see that character kind of peeking around a wall, and you go into them and see around that wall. That connection of kind of being in that character's head was something we wanted to preserve. But sometimes we do cheat it. We have an eye locator on every character, which is where your eye is going to be when you go into him. Sometimes we'll cheat it up a little bit and you'll be a foot over their head, or a foot in front or left. Not too far, usually between like a foot to 3 feet distance from a character. And we found that since we don't draw the player's body, most players don't notice. You can move it down a little bit or up a little bit, and that works pretty well. Cool, thank you. Anyone else? All right, well, thanks for coming to my talk. Again, I'm